da haben, der sich glücklicherweise bei uns eingefunden hat, weil er auf dem Weg zu einer Konferenz in den Niederlanden ist. Dr. Adair. Aaron, I'll switch to English now so that he knows what I'm saying about him.
Can't trust you otherwise.
Nah, I've got a reputation. Aaron is a professor of physics. I do admit I don't know Merrimack University. I apologize, I've never...
It's an Augustine Christian Catholic college.
Okay, interesting. Okay, he's doing a lot of research into physics and representation of physical events in the past. I think is a fair way to pronounce it. So one of his subjects is the Star of Bethlehem. He even has written a book about that. And I think lots of that will also be a subject of today. He promised me he will sneak in 1 or 2 aliens. So I'm really looking forward to that. So I think that's all I have to say about him. He will do the rest himself. Aaron Adair.
Guten Abend. Wie geht's? I've exhausted my German for now. All right, thank you for inviting me here. You guys have been treating me extraordinarily well, and I hope that I can make it worth your time coming tonight and let me talk about something that I've maybe talked too much about already in the past to others. I've lost a lot of friends this way, talking way too much about this. But ultimately what I want to do is try to talk about this intersection between science and religion as demonstrated by the talks and the books, the articles all about the Star of Bethlehem. But since I've come here, I've actually been feeling a little bit bad about doing this talk because I've now seen how connected this town is actually to the legend of the coming of the 3 kings to Bethlehem following the star, that it's such a big part of the town that your UNESCO cathedral and that. So I have to both destroy your history, your culture. I'm just going to be bad in every way possible, but that won't stop me. So let me begin then. And the way I'm going to break up my talk is into 3 things. One, I want to talk about the history of interpretations of this object. Where does it come from with these ideas of how to explain it through means that we might consider scientific or pseudoscientific? I want to then talk about what science does have to say about the subject matter. How well could we possibly explain this apparently miraculous story from the Bible with science that we actually do trust? And does it actually, make us think differently about the stories from the Bible? And in general, then, I want to talk about actually how we relate ancient myths to modern times, understanding what these myths are and what we're trying to make of them when we interpret them as our times. So to begin with then, like I say, I want to first talk about the various interpretations that have existed. And the best thing about doing old interpretations is a lot of beautiful artwork. This is a Botticelli painting, and it's actually showing the Medici family coming as the kings to the baby Jesus. So if you're a Medici, you like this painting. So the basic story that you have heard is basically this, and it's coming all from the Gospel of Matthew, the first story or the first book in the New Testament by an author who we don't actually know that well, even though the name Matthew is attached to it. And the basic story of this is that these Magi, the 3 kings, they're often called, and a Magi, a magus, is supposed to be a Zoroastrian priest, a major religion of ancient Persia. They have come to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? We have seen his star. We want to worship him." And they're coming to Jerusalem hoping to find him. And instead they come to King Herod, the paranoid king of Judea, who doesn't want there to be some other king of the Jews. So he inquires into what they had seen and says, "Okay, go search for this child. My scribes say he should be in Bethlehem because of these prophecies from the Hebrew Bible." The Magi go out and leave, and they see the star again, and lo and behold, it goes before them and stands over where the young child was. And this is all we are told of the star. It's composed in just basically 12 verses in ancient Greek about this story. And after this point, there have been plenty of other infancy stories. One that was just recently translated into a modern language is been called The Revelation of the Magi, where it gives the entire history of the Magi, takes them basically their traditions all the way back to before the flood of Noah. And they were basically visited by baby Jesus as a star to tell them to go grab some gifts for him, bring them to Bethlehem, and then see actual baby Jesus. So quite literally, baby Jesus is a star, shows up, and then helps them find their way all the way to the Holy Land from Persia. According to the translator here, actually all the way from China. So they're very much from the east, as east as they could go in the ancient world. And this is just one of literally dozens of different nativity stories or infancy stories of Jesus, some of them more believable than others. There's some stories, for example, of Jesus taming dragons while a baby, whisking off to Bethlehem or to Egypt on a cloud, things that we might consider less plausible. And we also have a lot of the early and medieval Christians telling us what they thought of this story, starting from about the middle of the 2nd century onward. And they're fairly consistent on a major point that they believe this story happened, and what they are ultimately describing is something truly out of this world. It cannot be explained by any of the sciences of the time. It can't be explained by astronomy, which was actually more advanced than you might think for that period. It can't be explained by the astrology of the time. And our sources for this are quite numerous, in fact, whether it's people like the 2nd century French or Gaulish Bishop Irenaeus. We have also St. Augustine, we have various popes, all agreeing about like the supernatural aspects of this star, about its movements being something that cannot possibly be fit with the knowledge of that time, that it must have been the hand of God basically coming in to guide the wise men to their destination. So already we see basically this very strong stance to say this is not science, this is truly something miraculous, and don't even try to explain it with this pagan pseudoscience-y astrology stuff. And that sort of interpretation also we can see in some of the artwork that comes along in the Middle Ages and later on, whether it's this 6th century mosaic of the wise men following the star, or we have the famous painting by Giotto of the Star of Bethlehem as a comet. There's actually been some controversy if this is actually supposed to be Halley's comet or some other comet close to the time of Giotto's painting, but nonetheless, using comet imagery for the nativity scene, and there's also this nice woodcut by Dürer, so a little bit of German art there as well for us. And like I say, it's very beautiful artwork, and it's all showing basically the star in kind of close proximity to the Earth, helping find where they're supposed to be going. Here, the Magi are clearly following the star to their destination. And in the medieval period later on, once we get to like past year 1000 or so, the intellectual climate of Europe was changing as it was being introduced basically to the sciences that they had lost during the Dark Ages. For basically 500 years, that effectively science had stopped in the Latin West until pretty much almost like to the Crusader period when things were being rediscovered from the Islamic world. And they were starting to have some interesting speculations about what the star was. So, for example, there is this figure here known as Roger Bacon. Has anyone ever heard of this person before? Couple people. Okay, so medieval thinker who was a big fan of basically doing science in a way of basically kind of like promoting the faith. And part of what he wanted to do was basically talk about the star, which he believed was still something supernatural, but put it in an astrological context so that way he could use that to say, look at what the stars were saying, to say something so great about our Savior. Isn't this awesome? And for his troubles, he was condemned by the church and basically imprisoned. He unfortunately was stepping over the lines theologically because he also wanted to make it so Jesus was actually affected by the stars as the astrologers thought. And they thought this was not theologically tenable because Jesus is supposed to be God after all. He should be beyond the stars. So he was condemned for his views from something called the Condemnation of 1277. And it's basically just this big list of theses you cannot believe or promote that were based on the works of Aristotle. And they said, say these things, you're in trouble with us. And so that apparently cost Bacon. About a century later, though, similar views are being promoted by a French cardinal, Pierre Daly, The thing that perhaps he's most famous for is that he had these predictions of the end of the world based on astrological theories, and they actually even influenced Christopher Columbus. He used this for his arguments to the King and Queen of Spain for why he needs to do his westward trips and try to convert people, because he believed the end of the world was only a couple centuries away. We got a mission quick. So that's the sort of influence this person had, but he also tried producing what we have as the earliest extant horoscope for Jesus, attempting to try to use astrology then to say something about his birth, even though, again, he believed the star was something truly out of this world, but again, we could use astrology to say something amazing about the birth of Jesus. And in both cases, the theory that they use of astrology, it's not something original to them. They were ultimately taking this from a system that they had learned from the Islamic world, and this is a system called the Great Conjunctions. Maybe they're not that great, but they were considered great by the astrologers. This is a system that we've been able to trace back of when it actually developed, and it looks like it comes from actually the region the Magi were from. It comes from Persia, sometime between the 3rd and the 7th centuries AD, and the idea ultimately behind it, which ultimately gets transmitted to the Latin world in the 12th, 13th century, is that every so often you have these conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. A conjunction is basically when the two stars have the same right ascension, that you could basically draw a line of latitude between the two of them in the sky. And this happens approximately every 20 years. And more than just that, they also happen in a fairly regular way, that they'll happen in one spot in the sky. They'll then take place in another part of the sky again, and they almost form this sort of almost perfect equilateral triangle as they bounce around. But that triangle isn't quite perfect, so it's actually rotating over the centuries, and it takes almost a full millennium to go through. So this was important to the Zoroastrians, who had this deep millennial belief. So things that happen in thousands are great. So this was a popular theory for them. And we know how this was applied to Jesus early on. The earliest use we found for it is with a Jewish astrologer known as Magi, who also composed the horoscope for the founding of Baghdad. He was there for Baghdad's founding in the late 8th, early 9th century under an Umayyad caliph, Abbasid caliph, I'm sorry. Got to get my Islamic caliphs straightened away. You can't, if you don't do that right, you're not doing anything. So the thing that he proposed, though, was a little bit different. So one of the most common theories for the Star of Bethlehem out there, based on conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, talks about conjunctions that happen in the constellation of Pisces, the fish. But Mashallah is using the theory to say that actually the conjunction he's looking for was actually in the constellation of Leo in the year 26 BCE. That's usually considered well before the time when Jesus was supposed to be born. But the sources Mashallah had were a bit confused, because sometimes he said the birth of Jesus was in 13 BCE. In other places he said it was 2. Our sources, our manuscript evidence there is a little bit weird. We don't know what's going on there because we don't have his original work. We have it from one of his later students, and so there's apparently some corruption in his sourcing. But nonetheless, this wasn't going to work then, and so later astrologers, before it goes to Europe, basically choose the 7 BCE conjunction in Pisces, because that was much closer to the time of Jesus, even though technically the way the theory was supposed to work is that this wasn't supposed to be the right conjunction for the birth of great, powerful men. That was supposed to have happened with this conjunction, as Mashallah proposed. So already they have to, break their own theory to do things. Astrology, making things up as you go along. But all of these ideas then started to coalesce in a person that we find very famous, and this coalesced almost exactly 400 years ago into this figure that you might be somewhat familiar with, Johannes Kepler, the often called the last great scientific astrologer and the beginning of modern scientific astronomy, known for his laws of planetary motion. And he also had some inspiration when it came to this story because of what was going on in his own time. So in the year 1603, there was one of these great conjunctions, and it was supposed to be one of the greatest of the conjunctions according to the astrological theory. So people were thinking something big is supposed to be happening. And then in the very next year, between Jupiter and Saturn in the sky, appeared a new star, very brilliant, in the constellation of Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. And new stars, of course, were usually an unusual sign. And this supernova seen in 1604 has been the last naked eye observable supernova we've seen in the Milky Way galaxy since then. We're way overdue for another one. I want to see my supernova, but I've been unlucky so far. Either I got to live a few more centuries or I need a time machine. I don't know what's going to happen first. But nonetheless, this supernova goes off. Kepler does very careful studies of it, both astronomically and astrologically of the time. And it's also around this time that he starts discovering some other arguments that's trying to affect the chronology of the world. At this time, everyone was basically figuring Jesus was born in 1 BCE on December 25th, and usually at midnight, as tradition had it. But he starts then composing this new chronology, and this book he has about this is published 400 years ago to this year. And it's the reason I'm going to be in the Netherlands this week, because the conference is supposed to celebrate the 400th anniversary of both this book and also the founding of the University of Groningen. So there's an excuse for why I'm doing this now. But 400 years ago, Kepler basically proposed the idea that the Christmas star could be related to the Great Conjunction of that time, again in Pisces in 7 BCE. And this basically was supposed to then have been the same sort of astrological theory the Magi had, because the theory that he was using also came from the east, so he was expecting it to be the same one. So the Magi should have already been expecting some great star in the sky due to the conjunctions, and lo and behold, that's what the Bible says they saw, some great new star. But contrary to how it's often told or mistold, that Kepler still thought that the star was something supernatural, something that was actually in the atmosphere floating around guiding the Magi. He's clear about this in his work from 1614. But usually that gets a little bit elided, saying Kepler said the conjunction, or the conjunction alone was the Star of Bethlehem, or the nova was the Star of Bethlehem. So this is basically the high point then for what's going on between the medieval period and the modern period, with the beginnings of astronomy. And with the beginnings of astronomy, the scientific method, and the Enlightenment, along comes doubt. People start saying, hey, the universe operates under uniform, regular laws. So why do we have these books that claim that those laws break down? And so you have people like here, David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher and historian, who basically said, what's more likely, somebody's wrong or the laws of physics broke down? That's a very short way of putting his great inquiry into human understanding. But that basic point still seems to hold. Which of the two things is more likely? So from this sort of thing, and that sort of influence becomes the beginning of what is known as the higher criticism of the Bible. Basically starting to say, all right, what in this book is actually true, what's false, what's legend, what's propaganda, starting to actually break that down rather than just treating it as an authority about what really happened. And a lot of this stuff actually started happening in Germany. In particular, there was the works of people such as here, Hermann Samuel Ramirez, who published his findings after he had died, because he knew he was going to be in trouble in his own lifetime if he had published what he had done. But basically, he was influenced by English deists about the nature of miracles or the lack thereof. And so he produced this great number of works that were then published by Gotthold Lessing in the newspapers in Hamburg, and caused a huge firestorm of controversy, where basically the author is basically saying all these stories are fake, from the Old Testament to the New, to the Exodus story, to the resurrection of Jesus. All is in doubt now, and some of it they even thought that the disciples were making things up to be sort of con artists. Obviously, that's going to upset people in a religiously conservative town in the late 18th century. And after this time comes probably one of the great giants of the higher criticism of this period, David Friedrich Strauss, who is, again, another German. And at the rather young age, I think he wasn't even quite 30 yet, he publishes this book in 1835 on the life of Jesus, critically examined. And it is the first more scientific attempt to really say what's history in the New Testament about Jesus, what's not. And again, what he proposed was very controversial. He lost his professorship in, I believe it was in Switzerland at the time he had his professorship. He lost it within a year of getting it because of his publication. But nonetheless, within 10 years, basically what his position was the consensus, was that vast majority, or at least a lot of the stuff in the Bible, the New Testament is not true, is not historical, and it's written in a sort of symbolic way on purpose. We need to examine the Bible critically. And one of the things that also makes his work stand out is because of who he was responding to. He wasn't just responding to those who still believed in miracles and said, no, these are historically implausible. He was also arguing against a group who thought they could explain the supernatural in the Bible, and they didn't have to give up any of their scientific beliefs. So in the late 18th, early 19th century, we have this group that it's mostly Protestants that are usually termed as the rationalists. The term, I think, mostly comes from the German philanthropist and Bible scholar Albert Schweitzer. So Schweitzer, of course, being very important for his philanthropic work, his Nobel Peace Prize, but also did this groundbreaking work in studying how people studied the historical Jesus, or how they created their own historical Jesus. But in this period, you basically have a problem. You believe the laws of physics. You believe the laws that Newton created can explain the universe just fine. And at this point, Newton's work has already been around for a century, and while Newton himself believed in the miraculous, by this point, either through continuing in scientific advances or because of what the French were doing and being very iconoclastic and breaking anything that looked religious in the Revolutionary period, you still have the issue that everything looks like we can explain by the science that we have. Nonetheless, we have this book with a whole bunch of stuff that says things that we know can't happen. We know people don't normally come back from the dead. We know people can't walk on water. We know people can't be born without sexual union, these sorts of things. Well, how are you supposed to accept this book with all this sort of stuff in there that you say can't possibly happen? How do you reconcile these two? How could anyone reconcile these two? In a way, you have to kind of insult the authors of the book, and their resolution is ultimately to say, the events really happened, but they were misunderstood, or we've been misreading them because we're just misinterpreting something that happened completely naturally but was interpreted in a supernatural way. And the most famous examples come from this figure, Heinrich Paulus, in some writings he had in 1830, explaining every single miracle in the New Testament through completely natural means. The most famous one is how Jesus could walk on water. It was a dark and stormy night, and the disciples are on a boat. They were being sloshed around by the storm, and they land on the shore. They can't tell because it's too dark and foggy. They don't know where they are, but they're beached. And so Jesus starts walking along the beach. They look out, they see their master coming, and they believe, oh my goodness, we're out in the middle of the water, and here he comes walking. He's walking on water, hence the miracle, or the lack thereof. Now imagine that being applied to every single miracle of the Bible, and you have the rationalist movement of the early 19th century. And the same sort of thing also happened with the Star of Bethlehem. One of the more famous versions that kind of got out there was done by this bishop, Frederick Munter, Bishop of Zeeland at that time, who was also scientifically minded. He was big into burgeoning archaeology that was beginning at that time. He started actually translating some of the earliest cuneiform tablets that were starting to come around. So smart guy, would have liked to meet him, but he was also trying to rationalize every miracle he could of the Bible. So now we come to this point. What can science tell us about the star? How much of this is actually something we can explain with what we know of how the universe works, or do we need to go back to miraculous explanations again? Well, there's been a lot of attempts to explain this, because we've been going on and doing this for about 200 years now of throwing out explanations. Those could be meteors, comets, a nova, a supernova. Those aren't the same sort of objects. Variable stars that change in brightness back and forth. Might just be a single planet rising in the sky. Some have proposed that Uranus was discovered almost 2,000 years earlier than it actually was, and that was the Star of Bethlehem. Or similarly, it could have been an asteroid that was first discovered. Again, those weren't discovered until the 19th century. There's been also various planetary conjunction hypotheses, whether it's the Jupiter-Saturn one or it's ones with Jupiter and Venus, which has become popular in some circles, even though there's a chronological issue with those. We also have the use of the horoscope of that period, using astrology, natal astrology of the time. Ball lightning is this strange atmospheric phenomenon, which basically it kind of what it describes. It looks like it's a ball of lightning that lasts from a few seconds to a minute and then explodes. So that would have been an awesome Star of Bethlehem, but that has its own issues. Zodiacal lights have been mentioned. This is something that's caused when you have the light of the sun reflecting on the dust of the solar system, and it reflects back, and it looks like this pillar of light in the horizon. That's been suggested as being the Star of Bethlehem. It's kind of guiding them down from the sky to Bethlehem itself. The precession of the equinoxes. That one's really weird to explain how it could possibly be the Star of Bethlehem, because this is basically the wobble of the Earth that has a 26,000 years. How you explain that for what happened on a single night is a little bit hard to do. But the phenomena of this precession of the equinoxes was known at this time. It was discovered somewhere around 150 BCE. So we've known about the effect for a long time, but how it could explain the star is very confused. And
Actually called the Platonic year.
sorry?
It's actually called the Platonic year.
Yes, it has had that label as well, yes. But this has probably been the most famous or infamous suggestion of recent times. The alien hypothesis has been seriously suggested by theologians and not so well-informed people as well, and has been on American television and shows, for example, Ancient Aliens. I don't know if that exists here in Europe, or if you're not protected from our insanity.
Not yet, but it will come soon.
Okay. Well, to be fair, though, the main proponent of that, Eric von Däniken, is Swiss, so it already has infected you. You just didn't know it. All right, so that's been a popular one, but like I say, there have been a lot of hypotheses out there because we've had years to build it up. So, I mean, if you just wanted to look at some of the recent literature on the subject, I mean, there's a few books you could start reading, or television shows you could watch, or planetarium shows you could go to. I mentioned there's a lot of books, and these are all like within the last 30, 40 years, by the way, including the previous pope, by the way, also had a few things to say on the subject, but he was kind of wishy-washy between natural, supernatural explanation. He wasn't quite clear, but yeah, pretty much anyone who's anyone has put out a hypothesis, it seems, about the Star of Bethlehem. There are so many books, and I haven't even included all the TV specials. I haven't included all the journal articles or the short mentions in other books as well. But I mean, in general, I think you could probably skip a lot of that, because I know a book you could possibly read that, you know, I might have a few of them on the desk here for later. Yeah, so I basically try to go through all these hypotheses in my book and explain what's wrong with them. But I will want to talk to you guys about what are some of the most popular candidates here and see what issues they have. So, for example, the idea that it might have been some sort of a comet. We know there was a comet seen in 5 BCE. We know that because the Chinese have meticulous records, and they talk about this great-tailed comet appearing in the sky in the spring of that year. So we definitely know there was a comet, but there's two issues. One, well, why this comet? Comets appear in a fairly regular way. Halley's comet had come about 7 years earlier. And in general, though, comets were seen in the ancient world as evil. Almost universally, when a comet's seen in the sky, somebody is in trouble. And it's almost never your guy who is going to be favored by it. It's usually the death of the king. It's a civil war sign. It means disease is coming. It's almost always bad. So this makes it unlikely to explain it, even if we don't go into the details of the gospel. The other idea is that it could have been a nova or a supernova, which is a star literally exploding. The mechanisms between novae and supernovae are different, and there are different types of supernovae. But again, it's been suggested that there was one seen in 5 BCE using the same Chinese records. Well, that's a bit confusing. If the Chinese record a comet, how could it be a nova? Well, this is where the authors try arguing that actually kind of screw up, because it clearly describes a comet. It says it has a big tail. So best we can tell from the records we have, there wasn't a nova or supernova seen at the time of Jesus' birth. So that kind of excludes it as a possibility. The conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, like I say, that has a very old pedigree. It literally goes all the way back to the Middle Ages in 8th, 9th, 10th century Islamic world. Though, of course, that doesn't go all the way back to the time of Jesus. The problem with this hypothesis is that the theory it bases on, the astrological theory, doesn't develop until maybe 500 years after Jesus. makes it a little bit hard to say that's what the Magi were thinking if they were trying to use a hypothesis that did not exist. It would be like 17th century people predicting the motions of things using special relativity before Einstein. Doesn't work. Or they have time travel, in which case they knew the physics anyways. Time travel solves everything. And perhaps the most rigorous explanation has come about, and is actually the main focus of the conference I'll be going to, a thesis by a retired astronomer, Michael Molnar, in a book that he published back in 1999. And he basically has it on two major fronts. One, it's supposed to be a conjunction, or an occultation actually, of the moon and Jupiter. An occultation meaning the moon is actually gone in front of Jupiter, and so you can't actually see the planet temporarily. An occultation might only last from a matter of seconds if it's just grazing, or it could actually even last up to maybe around half an hour, depending on how good the intersection is. Molnar claims that this was supposed to be a particularly powerfully good sign, and the rest of the horoscope that he reconstructs is supposed to say wonderful things about a person born at that time. And like I say, his is the most rigorous attempt to explain the star using astronomy and ancient astrology. But if we want to have any hypothesis work, there's a few questions we need to ask to see if it's the right stuff, if we're fooling ourselves or not. One we have to ask is, why only the Magi seem to be interested in this? If it was an astronomical event, why didn't everyone in the world notice? Why don't we have this in every record from the Aztecs to the Chinese? In part, this is usually explained by saying, well, the Magi were astrologers. This is a sort of esoteric knowledge. It would be like expecting the common person to know the mass of the Higgs boson right now. Maybe they've heard of a Higgs boson, but they wouldn't tell you what the mass is. They wouldn't know what the mass is. You only expect physicists to know anything about that. So it might be the same with the Magi. The only reason they showed up is because they are the only people who had the interest in the subject matter. That has the issue, of course, why didn't the Greeks and Romans get along with that as well? Because they also were big into astronomy and astrology, but that's another question. We might also want to ask, how do we know what the ancients would have thought about the object? What would have said to them, this is a sign of the king of the Jews being born, versus the king of the Syrians or the Roman emperor or anything else? And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, have to have the pointer in the opposite direction. Does this actually match what the Gospel of Matthew talks about? We can't just make something up and have it completely not conform to the story we're trying to explain. So this is the question that we're trying to do. But a big part of it is that means we need to do astrology. We're skeptics. That should make us groan a little bit. So let's do some astrology together. All right, you're way too excited to do this. All right. So now here's the thing. Now you guys are probably, I don't have to do too much to convince you that astrology doesn't work. If I look at your horoscope and I try to figure out your personality from it, and I don't have any other information, my chances of guessing right are pretty much no much better than chance. You guys probably accept that. I probably don't have to argue that too much, but this has been studied over 50 years to demonstrate that point, even though the astrologers will only make excuses about it. Even though there's been things published in Nature about it, for example, showing that it doesn't work, it's still out there. But this doesn't ultimately matter to a person who's arguing about the Star of Bethlehem, or the SOB as is known amongst people in the planetarium. I didn't make that up, no. So the thing is they're going to say is, well, all that matters is the interpretation. If we know how they would interpret it, it doesn't matter if they actually guess right or wrong in general. We just see this is what they would predict, and that explains why they would have made the trip. Here's the problem, though, with a group that have accuracy of no better than chance. You also have to ask, what's their precision? How much do they agree with each other? And that has been studied, too, scientifically amongst modern astrologers. And they're almost no better than chance. So not only can they not hit the broadside of a barn, they may not even be throwing their darts in the same direction of the barn the second time around. Literally, it's a drunk person throwing darts. Just get away. That's the accuracy and precision of an astrologer. A modern astrologer, and from the records we have, that's even true of ancient astrologers. They even say, this is the hardest subject there is. It's really hard to figure out what a horoscope means. And if they're telling you that they don't know what a horoscope means in general, we can't guess what it would mean in general to an ancient person. Literally, your guess is as good as mine or anybody else's. And if something can only be as good as basically random, it's not worth even doing. So not only is astrology wrong, It's worse than wrong. It can't even find out if it's wrong because it's just literally guessing everything at once. And like I say, when it comes to getting any answer you want, that is actually demonstrable from the ancient evidence. So for example, if I wanted to figure out what is the constellation that would be representing Judea or the Jews, which is usually something Star of Bethlehem proponents want to do. They want to say, okay, this is the constellation that they would expect to look at to find anything happening to the Hebrews. Well, depending on what source you look at, you're going to get a different result. So some will say that Aries, the ram, is the constellation or the sign of the Jews. Others seem to suggest that it's Aquarius or Gemini or a whole bunch of other ones. Or Judea is not even mentioned in their list of regions at all because it's just a little backwater. It's not as big as Egypt or Syria. I mean, why would Judea have its own constellation? There's only 12 of them, and you have places like Syria, you have Rome, you have Persia, you have Arabia. Why do they get a region just as much as a tiny little region of like Judea does? So the entire strategy is already a bit weird, and if you look at modern proponents for what they claim is the Star of Bethlehem, it's almost as diverse. People going for Pisces, if they want to use the conjunctions in 7 BCE, or they want to use Aries, or they want to use the constellation of Leo the Lion, and a whole bunch of others. Some proponents pretty much use every single constellation in the zodiac, and then some, to explain the Star of Bethlehem. So that's already a mess, and telling you there is something wrong with this strategy. There's something non-scientific about it. But if we do want to go to, like I say, the most sophisticated attempt at looking at a horoscope, that produced by Professor Molnar. This is the horoscope that he produces for Jesus, and specifically is supposed to take place on 17th of April, 6 BCE, right around sunrise in Bethlehem. That's his reconstruction based on ancient texts and also from the gospel account. So yeah, that seems like a lot of knowledge to put into one sort of thing. Now, one of the things, like I said, he mentioned is that this occultation of Jupiter by the moon, this was supposed to be a super powerfully awesome, terrific sign. Unless you ask the Babylonians and the Assyrians about what this meant to them, because all their records indicate that was the worst thing you could possibly have. That would say the king's going to die, there's going to be civil war, everyone panic. Cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria. It's October, I will quote Ghostbusters again, I'm sure. So, and quite literally, in their records, even if they thought there was a close approach of Jupiter and the moon, they were panicking and talking about, okay, let's take the king off the throne temporarily and put a pauper up there, so that way if anything bad happens, it'll happen to that person on the throne. And if nothing does bad happen, we'll kill him anyways just to make sure. So that way, no matter what, who was on the throne got what was coming to him. The ancients were weird. But nonetheless, that's very much in contradiction to what Professor Molnar has argued. Or if we look at the horoscope itself. So he claims that if you look at this based on the positions of like Saturn and Mercury, the closeness of Jupiter and the sun, things like that, that these are all supposed to indicate things of a really great horoscope. This would be like on par with the horoscope that was cast for Caesar Augustus. It's just super terrific awesome. I decided to look at the same sources and see what other interpretations were possible. And just with a quick perusing, I could find out that also Jesus could be a person who has epileptic seizures, who is a prostitute and is suffering from elephantiasis. I used the exact same sources he did, and I could get this result. How is that possible? I just looked at different aspects of the same horoscope. Literally, anything I want to do, anything I want to get out of this, I can find it. Ultimately, what I'm doing is hot reading. I know what I'm looking for, and I'm just going to make it look like my method appears to produce that sort of information. But ultimately, like I say, any horoscope you have, you can find what you are looking for, because there is almost countless different ways of considering the various conditions of the planets, if they're moving towards or away from each other, the relative position with each other, the constellation it happens in, and also the astrologers will break their own rules whenever they feel like it to make an argument. And of course, if they're wrong, they'll just change it afterwards anyways. We have many records of this happening in the ancient world where they basically make things up afterwards and then claim, yep, we're totally right. We know what we're doing. Nope. So that's the situation with, like I say, the most sophisticated attempt at using astrology to explain the motions of the star and then producing an exacting horoscope for Jesus. But This already seems like kind of a weird approach. I mean, if it weren't for the fact that it's giving us different results from different people doing the same thing, we really should be asking, shouldn't we have been doing historical analysis in the first place? Shouldn't we have at least first asked how plausible this story in the first place, instead of trying to find anything that we could use to fit it and make it real to us? So, I mean, there are questions that we should be asking about the source we have. One of those questions is, what is the source we have? What are we looking at? So we have, like I say, it's called the Gospel of Matthew as our source, our only independent source for this story. Well, who wrote it? I don't know. Nobody does. It's called the Gospel of Matthew, allegedly going back to this disciple of Jesus, but our earliest records seem to indicate it was anonymous. It had no name attached to it. That name and other names for the Gospels probably only came about in the late 2nd century. So we actually don't know who wrote it. If the person who wrote it was named Matthew, that's a coincidence. It's not the disciple. When was it written? Most New Testament introductions are going to probably say like around 80, 85. But if you really dig into the reasoning for it and all the problems it has, it really should be a lot more ambiguous. So this is the range I think it would fit into, anywhere between 70 CE and 155 CE. I know that's a pretty big range, but that's just because of how bad our records are for that time. But even in the best case scenario, that's nearly a century after the events it's talking about with the birth of Jesus. Now, being a long time after the fact doesn't necessarily mean you don't know what's going on if you have really good sources. What are Matthew's sources? He doesn't tell us. Most historians of the ancient world do tell us. So this is already a problem. Why don't they tell us what we want to know? From New Testament studies, we can tell that he uses the Gospel of Mark as a source, but the Gospel of Mark has no nativity story at all, so he's definitely not using Mark for that. We also know he uses the Old Testament a lot. He's clear about that because he says, I am quoting this from this prophet saying this and such was fulfilled by Jesus doing such and such. So we definitely know he used these two sources. Now, one of them isn't actually an historical source about Jesus, and the other one doesn't have anything to say about the birth of Jesus and has its own issues. If he used other sources is an open question. It's hard to tell because, again, Matthew doesn't tell us what his sources are, why he chose them, and why he thought they were useful. This is unlike any other historian of the ancient world. Even the bad historians of the classical world would at least do enough to say why they chose the sources they did and why they thought they were capable of doing something worthwhile. If he's doing a worse job with methods than even the worst historian, then we have to treat it even less charitably than the worst historian of antiquity. And there were some bad historians in antiquity, I can tell you. So that's already one bit of issue. But if we also want to compare what Matthew wrote to other things, it's a bit of a problem. So, for example, when was Jesus born? Depends on who you ask. If you go by the Gospel of Matthew, there's all this talk about events happening during the reign of Herod the Great, who we know from outside sources died in late 5, early 4 BCE. So Jesus has to be born before he dies in, say, 4 BCE. Okay. The Gospel of Luke, on the other hand, the only other canonical source that tells us about the birth of Jesus, puts it during this census of Judea, which we know happened in 6-7 CE. In other words, these two sources contradict by at least a decade. Oops. And that's not even the end of it. The most church figures were putting like the birth of Jesus like in 3 or 2 BCE. Apparently, they were also using the Gospel of Luke when saying Jesus was baptized by John at about the age of 30, and John was baptizing in the year 28-29 CE. So go back 30 years, that gives you about 3 or 2 BCE. You know, science. And that contradicts, of course, both sources. It's in between the two time regions that are not consistent with each other. So we already have a problem. And if you want to dig beyond that, there were Jewish and Jewish Christian sources that we have that were putting the birth of Jesus around 100 BCE. Wow. That's not, just adding a decimal by accident or something like this. This is a big problem, and the context, the historical context they put Jesus in is a completely different time before there was even a Roman Empire. And it's clear from that. It's not Judea being run by the Romans or anything like that. This is like even before the time of Julius Caesar. How'd that happen? Active question, and nobody really knows why. And of course, we want to ask even more specifically what day. Again, depends on what source. We celebrate Christmas on December 25th, and we say that's when Jesus was born. In ancient times, also in the Eastern churches, that they thought the birth of Jesus was January 6th. We tend to, in the West now, call that the Epiphany, when the wise men showed up and gave a bunch of gifts. And that's then how we get the 12 days of Christmas, between the 25th and the 6th. And then we have that really long song.
Is that because of calendar reforms, which were not followed in the Eastern churches? They have Julian dates still, I think.
Well, both these dates were existing during the era of the Julian calendar. So both of these existed in the 4th century, so concurrently. So it can't be explained by that. Part of the explanation I've seen for why that is actually on the East, they were using a different date for when Jesus was killed for the crucifixion, because also the Gospels disagree on what day Jesus was killed. And that might not be a big deal, but because of the way the Hebrew calendar is, that also affects what year Jesus was killed in, when he was crucified. So really complicated. This is what happens when you have a lunisolar calendar. Everything is hard. But like I say, apparently the two different churches had a different time for when they thought the crucifixion was, and how then they used that sort of system to figure out when Jesus was born, and so you get complications like this. But really, and there are lots of other sources that have Jesus being born everywhere from March to November. There's no consistency on anything. When was Jesus born? Your guess is as good as mine. Every other day has a 1 in 365 and a quarter day chance. If that's not enough, the story itself is rather implausible. I mean, this is even excluding the star part, just looking at the background the star is supposed to go into. So, again, a lot of the talk needs to be about who these 3 guys were, or allegedly 3. We don't know how many there were. The story just says it was plural, nor does it say they were kings, just that they were Magi, who we know a few things about from other records about who the Magi were. Again, these were Zoroastrian priests. Zoroastrianism is a different religion than Judaism. Why do they care about a Jewish Messiah? How many Protestants care about a new Buddha? That's really the situation we have, and even worse so, because the Zoroastrians had their own idea of a Messiah who would come at the end of the world and bring on an apocalyptic fight between good and evil. It's actually where the Jews got the idea from the Zoroastrians. So there's no reason to think why the Zoroastrians would have cared about a Jewish religious figure. They had their own. These were their own priests. They wouldn't be switching religions all of a sudden. And one of the things that indicate they weren't is the fact that we have inscriptions from them where they said they gladly persecuted Jews and Christians. That's a little weird to explain if literally your earlier members of your caste worshipped that person as a baby. That is really inconsistent. That is very, very weird, to say the least. Also, the whole idea of trying to explain the Star of Bethlehem with astrology depends on the Magi being astrologers. The records I've been able to find is that actually not until centuries later did the Magi have any interest in astrology. The whole premise that the whole thing is built on is not actually true. It wasn't until centuries later that they did anything with astrology, and not till after they really hated it for a long time. Basically, astrology to the Magi at this time was the same way as astrology is to fundamentalist Christians, either ignored or actively derided at the pulpit, or the equivalent thereof for the Zoroastrians. So this is already super duper weird, and let's also say we have this issue. If these guys were coming from the Far East, they are a part of the Persian government, coming to a Roman territory to say somebody else is king the Romans didn't approve of. This would be like the Soviet Union in the 1960s coming to Puerto Rico and establishing a new governor there, and the US didn't approve any of that. That would be a whole lot worse than the Cuban takeover, or communist takeover of Cuba in the 1960s, let alone then, of course, the buildup that happened after that. And this was supposed to have happened in a Roman territory under the guise of both King Herod, who had fought the Persians himself to get his kinghood, and Caesar Augustus, who was no friend of the Persians either. And they were supposed to go, meh. We have other situations like this happening in the region of Armenia, which would be like modern-day Turkey. And this was a buffer region between Rome and Persia, or the Parthian Empire, and they fought a lot about their territories, and Armenia was then that satellite region for them. And anytime the Persians tried saying, we want this person to be the leader, and the Romans didn't approve, it was either a diplomatic showdown or an actual war. And it was in a lot of historical records. The fact that Armenia gets all this mention and Judea gets nothing, even from sources who come directly from the court of King Herod, is supremely implausible. Oh, and also a miracle occurred. Let's not forget about that. What is this star supposed to be according to the story? And particularly in verse 9 of the 2nd chapter of Matthew. It has a star leading the Magi, literally leading, the verb it uses, leads them south from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. If you guys are amateur astronomers, you know stars don't go south. They go from east to west. Even when they're doing any other motions relative to the sky, they're still nowhere near as fast as the sky rotating. They're all going to go from east to west. The only thing that even has a chance of fixing that is a meteor, but that's just a flash in the pan. It's not going to actually lead you the full distance from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, which is probably about a 2-hour trip. Any meteor that lasts 2 hours already is a miracle. And then that star stops and then is hovering over a particular house. That is literally what the Greek tells us. The star travels south, stops, and hovers over a particular hovel within Bethlehem. Stars don't do that. If they did, it would look something like this. Actually, that's not even true, because the star is much larger than the Earth, and the curvature is so small, it would look like just this flat line all across. And we'd also be in the corona of the star, so we'd all be plasma. So everything is bad. Bad, 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 bad. This can't be a star. There is nothing astronomical that possibly fits that. Well, aliens, I guess, but they're not exactly stars. So, okay, alien hypothesis, the only thing left that could actually fit this if we want to believe the story happened, but everything's so implausible at this point, this doesn't make any sense. So the question is, why are we doing this really weird charade? Why have we been doing this for centuries? How is it that us in modern times deal with myth this way? By the way, what movie am I taking this from? Okay, just making sure. Yeah. Strangely enough, I first saw this movie while I was in Germany, so it felt appropriate. And it's a really fun movie, so. So when it comes to actually, figuring out what we're dealing with, what is a gospel anyways? And we tell you it's the Gospel of Matthew. Well, what is a gospel? There's been a lot of arguments about what the genre of a gospel is, and it's a bit controversial what my opinion is, but there's some scholarship to back it up, that it would fit in the category of ancient novel. We have novels written around this period, both by pagans and Jews, and if you look at the theories of how genre is decided and apply that, it seems like Matthew's gospel should fit in that category of novels. Not history books, not biographies, but active works of fiction. And this isn't an unusual thing in that period of writing symbolic narratives and putting them in semi-historical contexts. So one of the examples I could give is the trial of Jesus as portrayed in the Gospels, when Pilate is somehow thinking that he's innocent but just won't seem to let him go. If he's innocent, why is he still on trial? That's weird. And he basically says, okay, I got Jesus here, and I got this guy named Barabbas, who is a rebel, a killer of Romans, and for your ceremony, you get to choose one of them to let free. And even though the day before, the crowds were all like, yeah, we love Jesus, we'll do anything for you. And this time, it's like, no, give us Barabbas, kill Jesus, let him die. Yeah, 24 hours is a lot to people, apparently, in fictional books. Yes?
This is very, very important, but because they say his blood come on our heads, and this was the foundation for centuries of persecution of the Jews.
Yes. Yes, this is, in particular, the Matthean version, say, yeah, his blood be upon us, basically was the justification for claiming all Jews responsible for deicide. And, oh my goodness, did that bring about a lot of persecution. Okay, yeah. Thanks for bringing us down. But I mean, the whole story is just implausible. There isn't any evidence for a ceremony amongst the Jews for this like this. No giving up of a prisoner like this, let alone a known killer of Romans. Come on. And he's putting this Jesus on trial, even though he thinks he's innocent anyways. The whole thing doesn't make sense unless you look at it symbolically and you realize what's actually being done here in this story is a recounting of the scapegoat ritual as part of Yom Kippur, where one goat is sacrificed and the other one is released into the wilderness carrying along the sins of Israel. The two goats you're supposed to have for this are supposed to be as identical as possible, and that kind of shows the names. The name Barabbas is Aramaic for son of the Father, son of God. Jesus, of course, the Son of God. And in many manuscripts, it actually doesn't say Barabbas, it says Jesus Barabbas. So you have two Jesus, sons of the fathers, one who is killed and one who is released with the sins of Israel, and this is exactly like the Yom Kippur ritual. It's completely symbolic, it makes no sense as history at all. And this sort of thing you can find throughout the Gospels in all sorts of ways. This is a very common practice for the period amongst Jews and even pagans, taking their own myths and put them into sort of historical context for their own stories. This is true just as much for stories about like Old Testament figures as it is for stories about Isis and her followers amongst the pagans. And what happened then is that basically in later times this is lost because if you're trying to fight heretics, it's a whole lot easier to claim that you have the right position if you say, our stories really happened and we have this apostolic tradition that goes all the way back to Jesus to prove that we're right and you're wrong. So it gave all sorts of power if you could claim that your Jesus was true and the other ones were just completely made up, even though they were all made up. So then, of course, well, what is Matthew trying to do with this story? I see two major things that you'll find in the literature. One I defend more than the other. One is the story of a guiding star from Roman myth, from the Aeneid of Virgil, where it has this star that literally guides Aeneas from Turkey to Rome, where he then founds his kingdom. It also seems to be incorporating the ascent of Caesar to heaven, because after he died at the games that were glorifying him, a comet was seen as a new star, and people claimed that was Caesar's soul rising up to heaven. And the terminology that's also used in sources talking about this star refer to it as basically the morning star, which has a very similar language to what's used in Matthew 2 about the star that rises in the east. Seems to be talking about the same sort of thing. And on top of that, there's also some Old Testament precedent stuff of this Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled from Numbers 24:17. It's a prophecy from the pagan Balaam, the same person who had the talking donkey, and the donkey was talking back to him and giving him trouble. Talking donkeys, yeah, I know, totally legit. But that's the sort of story this comes from, and this was an actively used prophecy for like the coming of the Messiah, used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Talmud, amongst various other sources. So this seems to be a major thing that comes along. It's just the later interpretations that get a little bit weird. Whether you have the medievalists who still believe in the miraculous nature of the star and that it happened, but then trying to use astrology to explain more of it. You have then, of course, moderns like us who don't believe in the miraculous nearly as much, but then try to explain it completely naturally, using the same sorts of techniques. What it really is basically we are imposing our ideas onto the past to make it make sense to us again. We are bringing certain assumptions to this, and we're trying to make it conform to that, even though we're not really questioning if those assumptions are true or not, unless we're being good skeptics, aren't we? Aren't we? Making sure. That means being skeptical of me too, but of course I'm always right. And I mean, of course, there are some people who are in it just for their own religious faith, and some people are active apologists who have to just defend everything in the Gospels. So why do we use science for this? Well, there's a few different reasons why you would do science. For one thing is, we don't believe in miracles like we used to. You tell me a miraculous claim, I'm much more likely to doubt you now than if I were living 500-600 years ago, where miraculous stuff was called a day that ends in Y. I don't know if that translates to German well. Day that ends in Tag. Okay. And so anything that can explain this will work, including aliens. I include a picture here of Reverend Barry Downing, who in 1968 proposed the Star of Bethlehem was a UFO, a flying saucer, and all the other miracles of the Old and New Testament could also be explained by alien intervention. And that he published in this book, The Bible and Flying Saucers, that sold like hundreds of thousands, if not more, copies. Pretty popular book. And again, by somebody who actually has a divinity degree, trying to argue this sort of thing. Why aliens? Well, then at least everything can be naturally explained, and if we believe in aliens, then we can totally believe what the Bible says, and we can give it all sorts of religious authority. And in general, science has this amazing hold over people. It's important that we think the science is telling us what we think is true out there, that is actually providing truth to us. And so if science tells us something, then we're more likely to believe it. So you have groups such as the BioLogos Institute, the Templeton Foundation, members in those who try promoting this sort of thing, again, to try to reconcile science and religion. I've even seen attempts to use this same sort of naturalistic idea by young Earth creationists, people who think the Earth is 6,000 years old, there was a global flood 4,000 years ago, in contradiction to all science. Yeah, and yet there are guys like this guy, like Henry Morris, one of the founders of scientific creationism, trying to explain the Star of Bethlehem without any miracles at all, because again, then it feels more believable. It just has all sorts of apologetic value. So there's this apologist, Robert Newman, who basically says, even though he believes the Star of Bethlehem is supernatural, he still says like the various natural sequences to explain the star has great apologetic value. You can still win an argument using this even if you believe ultimately it can't be explained naturally. That's some weird stuff, it would seem. But basically, it defends the Bible, therefore it's good. It's really us imposing or others imposing their ideas onto the past when the past is so divorced from us and it's beyond our understanding, it's outside of what we expect. And this isn't just true for moderns, this was also true for ancients. When the Greeks of the time of Socrates and such are coming around, they're seeing the structures left by their ancestors in the Minoan civilization that collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age. And they built these magnificent structures. The Greeks didn't know how they were built, so they thought they were built by cyclopses, giants. So there are a lot of big architectures called Cyclopedian because of that. It wasn't cyclopses, it was just Greeks from a while ago. But this is how they were interpreting it because they didn't understand how it could happen. The same sort of thing happens with those who want to basically claim aliens did everything in the past because humans can't build pyramids, humans can't build machines, it must be aliens. Again, it's basically imposing our beliefs about things that, hey, there's no way some cavemen can figure this out because I can't figure this out, and I'm not going to try to figure this out, aliens. It's really the same sort of thing going on here. So we need to be careful when we ever look at the past that we are not forcing our views onto the past. So I now have to ask one other question amongst our skeptics here, amongst what I've said. Do you think Matthew made everything up? Do you think this was all completely his invention? Or do you think he was basing it on something before him? Second. So something before him. Any other opinions? I got one vote for completely made it up.
I vote for it, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Story's fake anyways. It doesn't matter if he based it on an earlier fake story. It might just matter in the sense of religious history. But here's a few things, though, that seem to suggest there might be more to it, because there are still some other sources that suggest there's a connection between Jesus and the stars beyond just this nativity story. For example, there's a hymn by Ignatius of Antioch, a bishop in the 2nd century, who has this hymn about Jesus basically as this super bright star and all the other stars and the sun and moon dancing around him in the sky. A lot of people think he's basing this on Matthew's story, but there's also a lot of scholarship that says, no, they just have a common source. But the two stories are extremely different. Jesus was not a star in the Gospel of Matthew. And yet he's being called an extremely bright star in this hymn. That's not the only one either. So for example, in the book of Revelation and in the second letter of Peter, Jesus is referred to as specifically the morning star. And this also has an interesting outer context because a god or a godlike being the morning star is not uncommon. So there's the Sumerian goddess Inanna, her Babylonian counterpart Ishtar, that are literally personifications of Venus, who are also gods that die in the go to the underworld, are resurrected after 3 days, and then return to heaven. Sound familiar? And yeah, they're also morning stars. There's also this other being in a Jewish novel called Joseph and Asenath, an angel that appears from the morning star who apparently has a bright countenance, controls the armies of heaven, and can apparently bring you back from the dead. And just in general, there seems to be some sort of connections between this morning star imagery and dying and rising gods of sorts. And there's also this visionary thing from the book of Revelation. And if you've read Revelation, you know it's basically like a 22-chapter acid trip. It's just really weird symbolism. And one of the weird things is this woman who is clothed with the sun, who is standing on the moon, who is extremely pregnant, and then gives birth to a child, while Satan, as a dragon, is waiting in the sky, waiting to chomp at the child, but then the child is taken up to heaven, and then there's a war in heaven. This is what happens in chapter 12. Yes, you would think you would have to have had some really bad moldy bread to come up with that. But there seems to be a lot of actual New Testament or Old Testament symbolism based on it. It's not just completely, I got high, this is what I saw. It seems to actually be a literary product. In particular, maybe something with Psalm 110, this coronation psalm that talks about the king being born from the dawn of morning, or in the Greek version, being born before the morning star. So I wondered if there was some sort of connection, and I want to reveal with you something I haven't published yet that I need to actually get vetted, but what I think is going on here, that I think there might be a common connection between this whole thing, and I think it's quite interesting. That I think there's an original myth here, and it actually goes back to the very beginning of the original myth about Jesus himself, basically, about what he was supposed to have been. And that ultimately, Jesus was considered the morning star after his resurrection, that he became this new brilliant being, either being based on ancient Near Eastern concepts of dying and rising gods, or in part because of interpretations of this psalm that was applied to Jesus a lot. It's quoted a lot in the Gospels, talking about how the Messiah actually has to have been be existent before the creation of time and space, that sort of amazing being. And that same sort of psalm also talks about the ultimate savior of the universe, the ultimate king, being born from the womb of dawn, born before the morning star. That seems to be some sort of connection there. The Ignatius Star hymn also seems to be related to this. And again, this is a hymn not about the birth of Jesus, but again, about apparently the resurrection of Jesus and his defeat of the demonic powers and his overcoming of death itself. That seems to be what Ignatius is talking about. I have to argue that because there's a lot of commentaries that think it actually is about the birth of Jesus, but I think they're wrong. A lot of details that have to be settled with that, but that's what I'm interpreting it as. And also, the revelation of that star symbol is ultimately, again, about the resurrection symbolism. There's commentaries from the 2nd century that back that up. And also, I think it explains the star vision seen in Revelation 12. The woman who is being born, who's giving birth to a king, all the sort of major tropes that are being symbolized there are all either from the coronation psalms of Psalm 2 and 110, which were commonly combined together to talk about the king. They were both about his coronation. And also a lot of the other symbolism about this woman being heavily pregnant and things like that, symbolizing basically Israel or the temple of Israel and its importance, but then put in a cosmic dimension. Now, of course, putting this all in a cosmic dimension might seem really weird, but there's a story that we actually have about that. There's this text called the Ascension of Isaiah, which talks about Jesus first being this brilliant entity living up with God in the 7th heaven. He then descends down through the various heavens until he's in the firmament, in the sky, and he's put on the body of a human, so he's disguised, to be killed by Satan and his demons in the sky. He dies, and then he is resurrected, and then he appears again as this brilliant entity and then rises up again. That sort of background also we find in what's called the Philippians kenosis hymn. It's considered actually the oldest bit of Christian liturgy that we have of all. It goes even back before the time of Paul, it's usually considered. So what I might be seeing here is that originally the idea of Jesus basically being a resurrected star being in the heavens, and then this story basically being recrafted into the version we see in Matthew as the birth of Jesus rather than the rebirth of Jesus. And I think Matthew knows that because of the symbolism he uses, how he structures the story. In particular, what are the gifts the Magi bring to Jesus? Do you remember? So the first two that usually get mentioned are gold and frankincense. And those are actually derived from Isaiah chapter 60 about kings coming to your rising light, bringing gifts of gold and frankincense. But the last gift, and I heard people mention this, is myrrh. And myrrh is a product that you use for embalming dead bodies. A weird thing to bring to a baby. But the thing you would bring to a dead body. So I think in part what Matthew is doing is actually structuring the story ultimately based on that and doing a process called euhemerization, taking a myth and then putting it into a new historical context and then presenting that and then, of course, interpreting it to the inside followers of what it really means. And so with that, I can use this idea to then properly do my War on Christmas. A true American holiday. Santa's packing heat. Thank you very much.